over the year, and earlier this year as a senior planner for Trinity County. What I'm going to talk with you about today is a presentation that I gave with Pincus Educational Legal Seminars, and I'm going to talk with you about the process of how we've gotten to where we're at with cannabis policy around the state of California. As we've all know and have heard, the state regulations are still in a time of change. And with that change, there are existing local policies that have become quickly out of date. There are also existing interpretations of local and state policy that could change too. And we know that local policies are going to change with some of the minor modifications that have happened around the 3.0 state regulations. So local jurisdictions are going to have to adjust their local policies. My goal in this presentation is to help you understand how the permitting and licensing process is formed, give examples of good and bad policy that I found during my research, and help you understand how you can use this information that is readily available within the public domain to change existing policy. So here are kind of the three layers of this presentation. And I invite you to fast forward if there's something that you find interesting. And I also am open to feedback and direction if you've heard of new policies that are coming out, or if the policies I'm about to cover have changed and improved. I would love to hear feedback. And you can find me at bilderberg.com. My email address is both at the beginning and end of this presentation. So let's jump in. Now, developing the permitting process happened in kind of three different buckets throughout the state. When local jurisdictions were first setting up their regulatory framework, most engaged in one of these three processes. They did this because most local decision makers didn't really understand or had very limited experience, at least that they were willing to share, with setting policy around cannabis. It was kind of this unknown policy area and unknown planning area. So it's kind of been a mix match. There's kind of the citizen-led bucket that some jurisdictions did. You know, the citizens write the first draft policy. It goes through the policymaking process. But what I've seen is there's a lot of knowledge gaps within the citizen-led policy. Without any fault to the citizens themselves, it's just things that they just don't know about either the industry, they don't understand policy and kind of these unintended consequences of setting this policy. And also, you know, there's some inherent bias. We know that with the banned cities and counties, there's a lot of bias in that banning. And I think that if folks actually knew, had a little bit deeper knowledge on the cannabis industry, that, you know, there's room for change there. And they kind of lack this sort of industry insight is kind of what I'm saying. Now there's this really cool process around a policy roundtable where everyone kind of gets in the same room at the same time and they kind of hash it out. That can actually be a hijacked process by the person or people that are controlling the agenda. And as a public policy professor of mine used to say, when you ask for the public's opinion, you have to do something with it. So it can get highly political, and you know, people that have these interesting takes and perspectives on cannabis policy are like, hey, you didn't do anything with mine. But the other side of the coin is you can get deep community buy-in when you have all the voices in the same room. So this is a very powerful model for public policy making, but you know, it's not without its warts. The third is consultants. You know, everybody loves consultants in the cannabis industry. They seem very prevalent throughout the industry around the state, but they can be expensive. Who implements these policies once the consultants write them? I've seen a lot of consultants that have written policy for one jurisdiction and then sort of hopped around the state and enacted that policy in multiple jurisdictions. Well, as planners, we know that no jurisdiction is the same, right? The land is different, the culture is different. There's so many differences, but to copy and paste policy around the state doesn't always work. And there have, unfortunately, I've seen cases of consultants influencing the permitting and licensing process in order to gain control over the operation and over the operators, which is totally unethical. And I'm completely against that. But the good thing is it's usually fast. And, you know, when you copy and paste something, It really does go fast. Um, but when consultants draft the policy, do they teach the staff? Do they teach the public? There's so much interpretation of someone else's policy that can kind of be bent in different ways, and whoever kind of is setting that agenda can really control how that policy is sort of rolled out and implemented. Now, what I did is I did a comparative analysis when I first started with Trinity County, because I kept hearing folks say, why don't we get all the information up front? Why do you keep adding info that I have to provide? As we were learning how OSHA was going to respond to, say, trimming facilities and processing facilities, which anybody that's been in a trim room, sort of off the grid in years past, can understand that the air quality gets really bad. So what's the air exchange rate that OSHA is going to require? These are some of the issues that sort of are slowly leaking out. But as operators, the worst thing that happens is you set up shop and then you find out about a new regulation, and now you have to completely retrofit your existing facilities, which can get quite expensive, especially when that happens as environmental health and public health and other sort of agencies kind of get their sort of thumbprint on the operation industry. So what I did is I did an overview of 88 jurisdictions with active cannabis policies from around the state. That included both cities and counties, and all the different regions of the state. I kind of cast a wide net, and my research methodology was quite simple. First, I started just looking at individual jurisdictions' websites. But that was kind of a little difficult to navigate. I didn't get a lot of insight in how those policies were developed, which of the buckets of the citizen-led roundtable consultant were used by different jurisdictions. So it was kind of a haphazard research. So I didn't get too far, but it didn't take long for me to switch gears and just start calling planning departments and start talking to folks. And I looked at 10 different jurisdictions who I was actually able to navigate their jurisdictional website and read their policies. They seemed good. I'm talking about Mendocino, Humboldt, Santa Cruz, Sacramento, just to name a few. But then my big aha moment was when I found CannaRegs, and that really sped up my research. And I was able to, in one place. I don't work for CannaRegs. I'm not paid by them, but I am a raving fan. I think that their product is by far and away extremely useful. But that really got the ball rolling, and I was really able to sort of dig in, and I created this giant spreadsheet of 31 different policy areas that I thought were going to kind of create friction and time, and then I started looking at different jurisdictions through the lens of these 31 policy issue areas, and those are some of the ones that I'm going to cover here in just a second. And I would be remiss if I didn't sort of point out that there is this giant regulatory ecosystem that currently exists that a lot of folks that are in the day-to-day, they're not really taking into account, for instance, fire code and how hoop houses, when you're running DEPs, how that sort of interacts, and that you have to have a separation of 12 feet, between different hoop houses. Why did that come about? Electrical code and lighting and HVAC. When can your local fire marshal give an exemption for fire from state fire code? That separation of 12 feet is one of those cases where you could get an exemption. Now, there's also building and permitting in the assessor's office. What constitutes a residential dwelling? That's something I'll cover in a second. Environmental impacts and remediation. I think folks with the way that temporaries have now leaked over into provisionals on the sort of path to annuals, people are really starting to get a foothold on CEQA and how environmental impacts and remediation sort of kind of interplay. There's also 3-acre conversions and defensible space in the more rural settings, forbearance and water storage from the water department and the state water board, and just sort of in comparing all these different policies between jurisdictions, we start seeing that some of these planning and policy folks from different jurisdictions have been deep in the California Fire Code and the Building Code and the Department of Industrial Relations. And they're pulling these sort of existing regulations into the cannabis space and saying, okay, how do these interact? It's not just the BCC or Cal Cannabis or MCSB. It's all of these regulatory agencies and the Air Quality Management District and several others. I have on their Business and Professions Code and Public Resources Code, and we know that the BCC and Cal Cannabis and these others are pulling their regulations that they've written sort of in isolation into the business and professionals code and health and safety code. So it's not just a mistake that those are on there, but it's to point out that there are existing regulations within these codes and the public resources code that we're going to have to abide by through the cannabis industry. And as we start peeling back sort of this artichoke to get to the heart of what it's going to take to operate a cannabis company in the state of California throughout the supply chain, we're starting to see how all these things sort of interplay. And the list goes on. So, which jurisdictions did I research? So here's kind of my favorites from cities and counties. So cities, obviously, there's a lot more cities. 482 cities and 58 counties throughout the state of California, and let's not even get into special districts; those are in the thousands. But so, this kind of take a look at this list and kind of peel back the policies in each of these jurisdictions. I think you'll find some pretty interesting things. Check this out. Chapter 6.88 of the Sacramento County Code is actually really interesting, right? You have to not only see who's doing things good, but also see where the fear is and where sort of the rationale for these banned jurisdictions. So in Sacramento County Code, it says cultivation increases the risk of criminal activity, degradation of the natural environment, excessive use of electricity, which may overload standard electrical systems, and damage to buildings in which cultivation occurs, including improper and dangerous electrical alterations and use, increased risk of fire and fire-related hazards, inadequate ventilation, increased occurrences of home invasion robberies, and similar crimes. Marijuana cultivation also creates increased nuisance impacts to neighboring properties because of the strong, I don't even know how to pronounce that word, but take a look at that, and noxious odors which come from the plants. That's in the County of Sacramento's code. So if you read that in their code or listen to it here and think about sort of what the regulated market looks like nowadays, I think that that's a little out of touch with what we're actually seeing in the regulated market. So policy things, I love this slide. I think that it really articulates what I was saying about the consultant-led sort of rollout of policy around the state. I think there's an interesting similarity here between these jurisdictions. I'm not sure if you can see it right off the bat, but I found this sort of framework in a few other jurisdictions, mostly in Southern California, and it's just kind of a classic case of one jurisdiction duplicating with changes another regulatory framework. And I'm not sure if this was a single consultant that copy and pasted, or the jurisdiction sort of said, "Oh, this is a great framework. Let's sort of adapt this to what we're doing." But I think this really highlights how policy has sort of rolled out over the last year or two. So I would be remiss if I didn't also point out that I am a accredited new urbanist. So a lot of my thinking stems from the rural to urban transect. It's a great policymaking framework. It's a way to say, okay, based on where you're at along this sort of spectrum, you have policies that are more appropriate in rural jurisdictions that are not appropriate in urban jurisdictions. And you'll see what I mean here in a minute, because this is sort of one of my major policies that drives me nuts in the state of California, is that you're looking at single use or straight line buffers, which I'm going to drop here in a second. But there's patterns in the language and approach to policy throughout jurisdictions that sort of remind me of, okay, wait a minute, red flag here. And what's that mean? Well, that means general plan and zoning code, right? General plan and zoning code, general plan sort of the community vision, and zoning code sort of how you're going to implement that vision. And when you start seeing these sort of planning topics within general plans and zoning codes, that's telling you, this is a new urbanism. This is a no car zone, so to speak. Well, not a no car zone, but more about walkability and form-based code and mixed use and infill development. So this is more towards the urban side of that framework. So when you're using tools and policies that are more appropriate for a rural situation, and you're starting to see these topics or these key terms in general plan, you should be saying, okay, hang on a second, we've got a mismatch here. And so what's that mean? Let me break that out for you. So this is a buffer straight line. So the buffer straight line says 600 feet from a location out in a radius. So this is a giant circle. Everything within that zone is buffered out. So you've got to be beyond that, or you can't have sensitive uses within that. And here's a code analysis from the Bureau of Cannabis Control 26054. States a premises license under this division shall not be located within a 600-foot radius of a youth center that is youth center, among others, in existence at the time of the license is issued. And this is important, unless a licensing authority or local jurisdiction specifies a different radius. Now, the buffer straight line is a tool that's more appropriate for that more rural setting. So when you see, this is in Fairfax, California, where I had a retail project a year or so ago, and we saw this, they're doing buffer straight line, but in their general plan, it's all about mixed use, it's all about walkability. So we're starting to see that mismatch in action. So that brings me to the shortest path analysis, which is one of my favorite new urbanism tools, and that says, no, not a straight line radius, but rather what's the distance that a human being would have to travel within this built environment in order to get from point A to point B. And let me just read this because I think it really sums it up well. In contrasting how to better plan for places with a mix of uses, new urbanism has developed an alternative zoning tool, the shortest path analysis. Now, in other jurisdictions, we've seen this called different things, which I'll go over here in a second, where the straight line radius tool often ignores common topographical geographies such as freeways or other environmental elements that provide physical barriers between incompatible uses. The shortest path analysis is based on a human scale perspective of measuring the separation of distances of incompatible uses along a pedestrian path of travel. Now, ultimately, the town of Fairfax didn't recognize the shortest path analysis as we proposed it, and the project was rejected without getting the Planning Commission. But nevertheless, it is important to keep the distinction between new urbanism and sprawl planning, as it could impact the location of cannabis businesses. Let me also point out that the straight line is often affiliated with Euclidean zoning, which is sort of that more car-oriented or suburban or rural type of planning. There's a great article that I've written on cnucalifornia.org that compares the straight line radius and the shortest path analysis tool. But there's hope. There are jurisdictions such as the city of Oakland that are recognizing that they're a dense urban environment and straight line is not the right tool for the separation of uses within their jurisdiction. Within the city of Oakland, it says the distance between facilities shall be measured via path of travel, which is kind of the same thing as shortest path analysis. Shortest path analysis is more the technical term. Path of travel is sort of the lay term for it. From door to door, what's the facility's closest door to the other facility? So I think that this is sort of, as things are sort of unfolding within the cannabis industry and around the state, this is sort of the right direction for dense urban environments such as the city of Oakland and others around the state. Not only big cities, but small downtowns such as the town of Fairfax, which is not a big city, but one that wants to create walkability, and they state it within their general plan, they should be using this tool rather than the straight line. Now, what about a setback buffer? Can you get an exemption? So this is actually a really interesting CUP that I uncovered in the city of Davis. They're granting a CUP to a manufacturing applicant, and they deemed that the project, in fitting with the zoning stated within their ordinance, within their zoning ordinance, was sufficiently buffered from sensitive uses, all while a swim school and a martial arts facility were across the parking lot from the proposed location. Now, within the city of Davis code, it states kind of exactly what I'm saying. It finds that no additional setback or radius is necessary for the establishment of a cannabis business pursuant to this article beyond the zoning regulations contained herein, which I think is fabulous. This is kind of on the vanguard of planning and buffers around the state of California. Here's proof of residency, which is an interesting policy that the Trinity County had implemented when they first started off regulating cannabis. And it was often said that the residency policy was included to make sure Trinity County residents would have jobs and created an advantage, so they'd be able to kind of get in the industry first. Also, it would keep outside investors away from investing in Trinity County properties. And I've read that several jurisdictions around the state of California have avoided the inclusion of residency requirement due to concerns that they may be discriminatory. And And I can tell you from firsthand experience that the Hmong community in Trinity County was especially hit hard by the proof of residency. As you can see in this photo, this was a bunch of receipts that an applicant used to try to prove that they were residents. And within Trinity County's code, it says verification of proof of residency in Trinity County for a 1 year period, providing a driver's license, ID card, or along with solid waste or utility bills, DMV registration. Well, if you're living off the grid in rural Trinity County, you don't have solid waste. You're off the grid, so you don't have utility district bills. So they're using, receipts from the hardware store to prove that they've been sort of active. Now, recently, as of a week or two, there was an amendment to the cultivation ordinance, and I believe it's sort of rippled throughout Trinity County's policies, and they're actually abandoning the residency requirement because, as they've stated, it's unconstitutional. So good job, Trinity County. Way to catch up. Now, I think public benefits are a more effective approach to kind of saying, okay, what's in it for the whole community here? Maybe it's not just sort of this high tax rate that I see a lot of jurisdictions sort of backing off of, but maybe there's a public benefits, a direct public benefits that cannabis businesses can sort of contribute back to the community at large. In one Southern California jurisdiction, the community benefits section of their CUP application reads, a detailed description of the benefits that a proposed business would provide to the local community, such as employment of local residents, voluntary contributions to civic organizations, sponsorship of community events, and similar such opportunities. Now, I've seen meetings dovetail around or devolve around grant making by cannabis businesses to neighborhood organizations. And essentially, it's like this: cannabis businesses have kind of sent a check for $20,000 or sometimes more to a local organization that they think is maybe going to be opposed to their CUP or their license approval. Then that organization is sort of caught in a whirlwind of internal debate as they decide whether they should accept the funds, what they should be spent on. It's not a very effective way to sort of get existing neighbor buy-in, but creating a public benefits package and sort of saying, okay, we have a grant fund that's administered by our cannabis business, and that allows community organizations to sort of apply for yearly funding or do direct funding through downtown or business improvement districts. That's a way more effective strategy. Now, on this slide, these different public benefit packages are part of my master's thesis, where I looked at business improvement districts and the services business improvement districts offer that are not offered by the local jurisdiction. And what I found is sort of wiring to Wi-Fi or offering free Wi-Fi was probably the highest ROI. So you get the most sort of spillover economics when you have free Wi-Fi. Another is public art, which who would have thought that public art or having something free to do and destinations to go to within local jurisdictions would have such a high ROI, but they were actually ranked number 2. Facade improvements and sustainability funding around green streets are also closely ranked within the top 5. Now, a neighbor compatibility plan is another effective strategy to ensure that you can mitigate adversarial nature of public meetings. Actually, in May of this year, at a variance hearing up in Trinity County, we actually had a neighbor of a proposed cultivation site actually have a heart attack in the middle of a planning commission meeting. Luckily, there was a grower in the community who was a volunteer firefighter, and he was able to resuscitate the neighbor, and he survived. So I think that it was a very unfortunate event, but I think that kind of highlights how contentious these community meetings really can be. So kind of implementing a neighborhood compatibility plan, and this is not something that cannabis operators need to wait for a jurisdiction to sort of implement, but it's one that they can read in other jurisdictions, say, okay, I want to follow this with, although it's not required, I think it's something that could really speed up the approval process and remove this sort of adversarial nature. Now, the city of Sacramento has a very effective policy whereby they require during their permitting process neighbor outreach. And I have a client in Sacramento that is going through this process right now. We actually submitted the CUP application the day before I gave this presentation in LA for Pincus. And Within their answer to their neighborhood compatibility plan, we outlined several months in which the applicants had engaged in community outreach, including attending standard meetings like attending Sacramento-sponsored stakeholder meetings for cannabis, but they also attended the local business improvement district, or BID, meetings. They attended chamber of commerce meetings, meetings with direct one-on-ones with the council members' field rep, and then they got into some more creative engagements, such as helping organize street art murals and a local street festival. Now, the work with the bid is a huge help in their sort of local support, and it really helped sort of set their application apart from maybe some of the others. And you can see here in the code analysis, the city of Sacramento sort of calls out some of these things that you can do in order to gain sort of pre-approval within the jurisdictions. Now, fencing is kind of an interesting one. In Trinity County, the fencing policy was to have wildlife exclusionary fencing. Well, what's that mean? Because the policy is not very clear, we ended up having trees being cut down and used as in lieu of fence posts. You can kind of see in this picture here that there are actually this black plastic is staple gunned with kind of random boards to trees, and that's the fence that's used because it's not spelled out within the policy. I found in the city of San Luis Obispo, their fencing policy is very strong, very robust, and it's one that could potentially be sort of a template for other jurisdictions. And I really like that all outdoor and mixed light cultivation sites should be screened by native fire-resistant vegetation and fences with locked gates. I think that that's really the right approach. That natural vegetation screening, I think, is definitely the way to go in, again, these more rural settings. I've also seen jurisdictions that don't allow chain link fence in the sort of more affluent fence or more affluent jurisdictions. It's like, okay, you're not going to allow chain link fence. There's not enough room for natural vegetation to sort of screen. So what are they supposed to do? Like wrought iron fences? That could be really expensive. Parking ratios. Oh my gosh, this is such a hot topic. I think it's one that's going to just grow in importance as businesses, the successful ones, start to expand or they start to add different links on the supply chain to their existing business. This image is from my hometown, the city of Martinez, where the applicant and their permitting team were on point in the way that they argued their parking ratios. Now, let me back up real quick and give sort of the broad overview. Most jurisdictions connect the gross floor area of a use to the required number of parking spaces. So in this example, the 500 square foot office is required to have one parking space, and the 2,200 square feet of manufacturing is required to have 4 parking spaces, or 1 per 600 square feet. So this applicant argues successfully, I might add, that the 10,900 square feet of storage loading is exempt from any parking spaces, which is pretty awesome because any developer is going to tell you that parking spaces are extremely expensive and they offer very little in return as far as getting your sort of upfront capital costs back. It takes a long time and you sort of have to build that into the price of your products. So parking ratios do vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and I've noticed that similar sort of to that rural to urban transect that I went over a little bit ago, the denser the environment, the lower the ratio of parking required, whereby you can argue that being closer to public transit, or even better, that a walkable community should have a lower parking demand. Here's something else I want to read to you. It comes from the LA Orange County metro area. It's an excerpt from an article that I found recently. And it says that the percentage of commuters in the LA Orange County metro area that traveled to work alone in a vehicle actually rose by 80 basis points to 74.6% between 2013 and 2016. This is the greatest increase among the largest U.S. office markets, underscoring the need for landlords to provide adequate parking to tenants. Now, this is especially true in the suburban areas that lack public transit options. Now, prevailing parking ratios for Los Angeles suburban office properties range from 3.5 to 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet, compared with 1 parking space per 1,000 square feet in downtown LA, where public transit is more readily available. So this is a parking ratio declines only modestly in LA. So Google that, and you can probably find the original article out there and read the rest for yourself. But I think that this is an effective strategy, and one of the best ways for owners to adapt to recent and future transportation changes is to create sort of this vehicle pickup and drop-off zone, so that people using ride-sharing services such as Lyft and Uber today and autonomous vehicles tomorrow have a place that they can drop off and pick up, and it also could be used as an effective parking reduction strategy. And I would also look for exemptions for areas used exclusively for truck loading and storage from the parking calculation of floor space and require off-street parking. This can be found often within zoning code, and it's one very effective strategy that the applicant here in my hometown in the city of Martinez has used. So I would encourage you to take a look at their arguments. It's in the conditional use permit application that it's publicly available on the city of Martinez's website. This is residences. This is a licensed and permitted cultivation site in Trinity County, and this is their residence. And there's a residence policy that everyone has to have a single family home on their cultivation site. I have a whole thing on this, but I think this picture really says it all. The policy doesn't work, and once more, the implementation of the policy really needs to yeah. Anyway, says enough here. Now, environmental health. This is an interesting one. This image is taken from an article published about a month or two ago in the county of Humboldt. This is a licensed cultivation site, and as we can see, they've got generators that are running a lot of their electricity. They've got diesel tanks to fuel those generators, and this is an environmental health nightmare. Now, the article I found this image in, which I should have the citation here, but I think that if you here it is. It's kymkemp.com. You can Google environmental damage, marijuana grow, sheriff's department. I'm sure you can find the article if you Google that. Now, the article states that between the 4 parcels that are part of this cultivation site, assisting agencies found the following violations: 5 water pollution violations, up to $20,000 per fine per day. 2 disposing trash in or near waterway violations, $20,000 per day per violation. 3 water diversion, $8,000 per day per violation. 2 failure to submit hazmat business plan violations, $70,000 per day. Failure to prevent hazardous waste release, $70,000 per day. Failure to report hazardous waste release, $70,000 per day. Failure to label hazardous waste, $70,000 per day. Now, here's a code analysis of the management of waste and hazardous waste materials. And, it really says right there that you really need to have your hazardous materials business plan pretty tight, and you need to account for this. And, I'm not talking about crazy things here. If you see these dark sort of spots on the soil underneath the generator, that's what I'm talking about. That kind of stuff is having these extremely high fines per day. And lead batteries, you can see that at the bottom right of the screen. $70,000 per day on the management of lead acid batteries. That is crazy. So I think that as environmental health starts to take a hold in the cannabis community, that's going to be a real uphill battle for a lot of operators that are legacy operators that have these violations that, in their day-to-day, they don't think about it. But having, a consultant or some sort of advisor or jurisdictions and agencies having very easy to read and intuitive handouts that really take these potential fines and violations and spell them out is going to be critical. But it's no wonder that some of these banned jurisdictions are so anti, like I read a little bit ago around the Sacramento County, because they're seeing these types of sites on a daily basis. So it's no wonder that they're sort of, in my opinion, overreacting and over-regulating or just outright banning it, because they see these types of situations within their jurisdiction as they do code enforcement, or this is a BHO laboratory in Chico that was unregulated, and when these BHO labs blow up, that's what makes the headlines. And that's, a lot of regulators and public servants, this is what they think about when they start talking about extraction. This is their mental image. And it's kind of valid because this type of setup is often sort of, explosive, so to speak. So I think that as the regulated market starts to roll out, this is the type of environment that the regulated market actually looks like. Um, Now, this is Care by Design's manufacturing facilities. I found this on the Facebook group in the state of California. I think it's City and County Regulation Watch. Um, but I would say check out Shasta Lake for waste management and San Luis Obispo for hazardous waste. They've got really good policies that if your jurisdiction doesn't have good policies, at least you can look at these other ones and go, okay, I want to get in front of all those fines. I don't want to lose my business because I forgot to take a battery down to the hazardous waste facility. So, look at these good jurisdictions and figure out ways to kind of navigate the system, even if your jurisdiction is not being proactive. I mean, that's what I would encourage. And when you look at this image, I mean, you would never know that this is a cannabis operation. I mean, it looks like a laboratory for a pharmaceutical company. I mean, maybe for the guy's hat that's backwards, that's maybe the one giveaway. But other than that, I mean, it really looks like a professional setting. And I think that when regulators and different agencies start having this as their mental image, I think that we're going to really start seeing a lot more positive change and sort of I don't know, just a better environment for cannabis operators to operate within. Now, I mentioned hoop houses earlier. I wanted to quickly go over hoop houses. These are two hoop houses. This is what hoop houses look like. They're basically just a way to kind of get a little bit more growth out of your plants, and a lot of folks pull tarps and use depths to sort of speed up the flowering process. Within the fire code, separation is 12 feet between hoop houses. So you can see right here, it is sort of estimating these are maybe 6 feet apart. So this person has to break down their operation, move their hoop house another 6 feet over in order to get that fire separation. And when you start looking in the fire code, and I've got this great little link at the bottom here, up.codes, you can read it there. But that's not a cutoff. It's not cutting off the whole thing. It actually is up.codes. Great pool of codes for fire code, building code, and others there that are completely free. And when you're looking at the fire code for building standards relating to tents and membrane structures, you can see California Code of Regulations, Title 24, Part 9, available at this link. And that actually says, Chapter 31, tents and other membrane structures, say 3103.8.6, a fire break or an unobstructed fire break passageway or fire road not less than 12 feet wide and free from guy ropes or other obstructions shall be maintained on all sides of tents and membrane structures unless otherwise approved by a fire code official. When I read that, when I think about what that means, that's really talking about like circuses. Guy ropes, there's no guy ropes on hoop houses. So there's kind of a mismatch here. Again, tents and other membrane structures, yeah, maybe for the carnival that makes sense, but these are hoop houses. There's not going to be the public. These facilities are closed off for the public. Public's not going to be here. So I would definitely, if you were doing hoop houses and you were concerned about separation and that was eating up too much space on your cultivation site, talk to the fire code official and see if you can get an exemption. Now, here's one of my personal favorites, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. I think everyone who engages in cannabis-related business ought to remember that the industry would not be where it is today without the great work of the LGBT movement made during the HIV epidemic during the 80s. The root of the cannabis legalization is in this activism. Today, in the regulated environment, we must keep in mind that safe access to those in need is extremely important. In addition to compassion programs, physical access to retail and other facilities, both by the general public and employees, is necessary. Furthermore, I would estimate operators often ignore the ADA and they may face a harsh reality when litigation ensues. ADA litigation is no joke, and that's accessible parking, path of travel, making sure that when you park your car, you've got a clear and unobstructed path of travel from your vehicle to, or the bus if you're in an urban environment, to the cultivation site or the retail establishment or the manufacturing facility. And you've got to have universal design. So your doors and your aisles and your restrooms are all navigable by folks with limited mobility. And that includes both employees and public access. Again, I cannot stress how important it is to look into the ADA. It's a federal policy, so you're not going to find it in state code. You may not find it in your local jurisdiction because they may not be thinking about it yet. But ultimately, this is one of those sort of blind stumbling blocks that I just hope people keep in mind when they're designing their facilities. Greenhouse gas emissions calculations. Now, folks that do curing or that do indoor grows know that everything has to be temperature and humidity controlled. You've got all these fans and humidifiers and dehumidifiers, depending on what you're doing, sort of changing the sort of ambient air quality. And it's really important to start thinking about these ahead of time. And the renewable energy requirements that Cal Cannabis is calling out in 2023. Again, when you're setting up your facilities, you need to be way forward looking. And if you're doing a 4,000 amp indoor grow, when these renewable energy calculations come out, what are you going to do? How are you going to adapt to that? I think that some of the grows that are being set up in the desert of California that are 115 and they're going to be cooling their indoor grow, I think that they're insane. The energy calculation to keep that facility growing good cannabis flower, it's going to be so intensive. What are they going to do for their GHG calculations in 2023? I don't know. So energy load calculations, there's a cool little tool that the city of Shasta Lake has, this utility load tool. It's a little elementary, but it'll get you sort of started thinking in this direction. Cal EE Mod, the California Emissions Estimator Model, is a statewide land use emissions computer model designed to provide a uniform platform for government agencies, land use planners, environmental professionals to kind of understand the greenhouse gas emissions associated both with construction and operations of a variety of land use projects. So Cal EE Mod is the tool that a lot of folks use for GHG calculations for CEQA. It's one that I've used for several different projects in lots of different industries. So this is definitely another thing that you absolutely, folks, really need to keep in mind. So now that you've had a kind of an overview of some good and bad policies, what about amending the existing policy or ordinance? I think that this is critical. Now's the time for amendments to start rolling out in a lot of jurisdictions. And it's time that we can start using some of this information that's been built up to create positive change for the cannabis industry. And I think it's critical. Now is the most important time. I really wish there was sort of a Saul Alinsky of cannabis that would really focus on organizing a lot more of the community. I definitely think that some of the social media groups that are going on are really helping sort of the advocacy of good policy. But I would recommend providing email communication either from state agencies and an interpretation that's kind of in conflict with the local jurisdiction, or provide written amendments using track changes for public meetings. This is a planning commission meeting, and there are open public comments at every single public meeting. That's the Brown Act. Those that know about the Brown Act know that the public has an opportunity to shape policy. So put your ideas out there in open public comment. If you're not good at public speaking, have a friend read it for you, or simply walk up there and say, I have this written down, I want to hand it to you. And that will become part of the public record. Another way is contacting planners and asking them to present information in matters from staff at the end of these meetings. Another idea is to contact elected or appointed officials, but you have to kind of be careful with elected and appointed officials, because when you start getting political and different stuff, you may go to one elected official and they may be sympathetic to you, but the other four, or however many are on that decision-making body, they may not like that person. And so your idea may get spiked just because you went to the wrong person. So be careful about that. I would recommend going open public comment first, matters from staff second. If you're able to kind of get some buy-in, or after the meeting, if anyone comes up to you and wants to talk more about it, linger at these meetings, hang out, go see what's happening, how people are thinking, research who people are, and how they make their decisions and why they make their decisions, and write your amendments to people's inherent biases. If you've got 3 members of your local jurisdiction that are all environmental people, write from an environmental voice. Use that to your advantage. But the most important thing is connect and organize. Connect and organize with other cannabis-related businesses. This is an image that I found. I believe it's from up in it's a growers association that I'm not remembering right now, but this is what organization looks like. Everyone that supports a decision holds this green piece of paper, and they don't support it, they hold up this red piece of paper. I've been in a lot of public meetings across the state where people just start shouting, and it's actually a disservice when you start interrupting the meeting. But this kind of quiet sea of green is probably a way more effective strategy to get the decision makers to start going, okay, there's a lot of support for us to make this change. Maybe we should do this. Anyway, yeah. So this picture is from Gold Country, up in kind of. Anyway, I don't really remember, but here we go. Another really effective strategy for creating change is if you're not going to write sort of this amended, hey, these are all the different words I would change within this ordinance. One thing you can do is just ask a really effective question to help shape policy. Now, this is kind of my personal style, and I've seen a lot of contentious meetings where people are actually getting personal and somewhat responding to each other through public comment on different agenda items. But if you go up there and kind of cross-cut the conversation with a really effective question, that can actually get both sides to kind of go, take a step back and go, wait a minute, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we should start thinking of it in a different way, and really kind of evoking new thought rather than simply arguing a point. So thanks for listening. I hope you found this helpful. These are some of the other topics that I'm personally interested in, that I would welcome future conversations around. Here's my contact information. Again, this presentation was part of the Pincus Professional Education Seminars in November of 2018 in LA, but hopefully you found it helpful.